Anyway, we've been watching very closely the story about whether or not conservatives and Tea Party members, part of the Republican caucus, are being purged from their committee assignments because of some type of, quota list on specific votes that may have taken place. And, finally, one person was able to ask Speaker Boehner after he lost his committee assignment. Representative Justin Amash is back with us. Sir, hopefully you have some news to share with us of whether or not there was some type of scorecard being used in this decision. Is that true? You asked Speaker Boehner?
Yeah, thanks for having me on again, Sean. And Tim Huelskamp and David Schweiker and I sent a letter to the Speaker, and we got a response the other day, and it's basically a non-response. He says there's no scorecard or any other single criteria used to determine committee assignments. In other words, he's saying that there could be a scorecard, but he's not going to admit that it was the only thing used. And right now, from the conversations I've had with people in leadership and people on the committee, it's very clear there was a scorecard used. And in fact, my score on it, I was told, was a 0. And which will be really interesting news to my constituents who elected me to go and balance the budget. They know I'm fighting for their values and fighting to limit government. And our leadership decided that that was worthy of a 0.
So in other words, those members that voted more conservatively are being punished by being removed from their committee assignments.
Well, we'll want to see the scorecard to see what the reason is. That's at this point seems to be the case, that those who voted for less government were given negative scores, and those who voted for more government were given positive scores. And so I'd like to see the scorecard. I'm sure there are a lot of conservatives who have very low scores, and we just want answers.
Who told you it was a 0?
Well, someone very high up in leadership, and I'm not ready to divulge that, but because I've tried to keep these conversations as
well, isn't there a committee that makes this decision? How many people are in that committee?
Well, there's a committee. I don't know exactly the number of members on the committee. It's probably about a couple dozen people.
So it would be Cantor, Boehner, McCarthy. I think Paul Ryan is he involved in these decisions, or?
Sure, it's a steering committee. The interesting thing about the Speaker's letter is that he says that the decision was made with the assent of a majority of the steering committee. So he doesn't say with a vote of the steering committee. He says with the assent, which, knowing how things work here in D.C., how they cleverly craft their language, that means to me that there probably wasn't a vote. There probably was a group of leadership who came in and said, we want to boot these guys off, and said to the room, everyone okay with that? And, of course, they're on the steering committee. They don't want their own jobs put at risk, and so people assent.
Well, let me ask this then, because I think this is now hitting a critical mass of some kind. Did they ever sit down and talk with you about this?
No, absolutely not. In other words, we didn't know going into it what criteria would be used. In fact, they didn't even tell me after they booted me off the committee. They let that leak through the press. They had leadership aides. So staff members actually went and leaked it to the press, and I had to read about it in the newspaper, and I didn't get a chance to talk to leadership for 3 days because they didn't approach me. I gave them the opportunity to come to me, to tell me about it, to explain it to me, and they never did. So finally, 3 days after the fact, I had to go talk to a couple members of leadership myself to try to get some answers. And
who did you talk to?
Well, a couple of members very high up, and
why don't you want to mention their names?
Well, I'd like to see how we are working through particularly the Republican Study Committee and other groups here to try to get this resolved in some way. We want to get some answers, and so I want to give
Were you told, was there any hope given, or is this decision final?
Well, as far as I know, the decision is final, but we want to give them the opportunity to make amends. We want to give them the opportunity over the next several weeks to say, look, we made a mistake. Here's what should have happened, and here's a resolution. Here's a way we can set this straight and put things back right path.
Let me ask you.
I want to give them that opportunity. I'm not trying to be a thorn in the side of our leadership team. I think we need to be working together as Republicans. But to do that, we need to understand what leadership was doing here.
What about in conference? Was there anything insinuated by anybody in leadership that this may just be the beginning if you don't go along with this fiscal cliff deal, whatever it ends up being?
Sure, I think it's it's public knowledge now that Speaker Boehner implied that if people don't get in line, they have the chance to be booted off committees as well. That
Speaker Boehner said that specifically in conference?
Well, I think that's public news now. That the Speaker implied that.
Well, forget it. I'm asking if you heard it.
Well, I don't speak about what happened in conference, but I've heard it in my own in the reports I've seen that Speaker Boehner, said to us, "Sure, if you don't get in line, you could be next."
Joining us also, by the way, as we continue with Congressman Amash, we have Congressman Tim Huelskamp is with us from Kansas. He was also kicked off the, I think it was the House Budget Committee. Were you also taken off an agricultural committee too, or?
Yes, I was, Sean, a fifth-generation farmer. Kansas has been represented on that committee for 100 years, and apparently we've been removed from that committee and with absolutely no notice again and no explanation. And we've asked and asked and asked, and here we are awaiting an answer and a response, and my constituents are as well.
Well, Congressman Amash just said to us that he got a letter from Speaker Boehner. I assume that you've seen it by now.
Yes, I received the identical letter, and it said the same identical thing about nothing, and just said, you know what, these kind of decisions, they take place behind closed doors, and we're not going to tell you what the reason was, and we're not going to release the scorecard that was used in part apparently to make these decisions. And I've been very clear. I'm a conservative. I have clear conservative principles. People agree and disagree with them, Sean. My constituents support them. And we've had a flood of, I think, bad bills, and I voted against them. I voted for what I thought was the right thing. But at the end of the day, it's my constituents that I owe allegiance to, not anybody in Washington, D.C.
You know what surprised me, and Congressman Amash and Congressman Huelskamp are with us, both have been removed from their committees, is the lack of, solidarity from your fellow members in terms of their willingness to publicly come out and support you and say that if there is a scorecard, then we ought to eliminate this, and that it ought to be based on your work. And I'm particularly concerned if this is true. There's a purging then of conservative members, Tea Party members. Now, I look to the Republican Party as the party of limited government, greater freedom, balanced budgets, a party that's going to be a bright-colored contrast, to quote Reagan, bright-colored differences, bold-colored differences to the Democratic Party. I'm not looking for pale pastels here. There's too much at stake. We're robbing from our kids and our grandkids. So are other members coming to you and saying, we'll support you, or?
We are hearing some of that, Sean, and again, but a lot of folks think it's important what committees they're on, and it probably is. But so
they're all looking out for their own back.
I'm afraid of that, but like you, I'm worried about where we head as a country. This is just not about Tim Huelskamp and Justin Amash and numerous other folks. It's whether or not our conservative principles, whether they get pushed to the side just a week or so after the election in order to reach some compromise with Barack Obama. I mean, he's heading down a trail of, I believe, of socialism, destruction of this country, and now's the time that we speak out, not the time to lay back and say, gosh, can't we be reasonable and all get along?
I totally sincerely agree with that. I don't know where this is headed. Congressman Amash, have you heard anything in terms of where the negotiations stand at this point?
Well, I don't think they're going in a good direction. When we're talking about the fiscal cliff deals that are being offered, whether it's the president or Speaker Boehner, both of them are talking about increasing our debt by $8 or $9 trillion over the next 10 years. So, look, the difference is minuscule. And it's important that the American people understand that. We were elected to Congress to represent the American people, the vast majority of whom want us to balance our budget. And they don't care whether we work with Democrats or Republicans. They want us to work together, but they want us to get the job done, and they're not getting the job done right now.
Well, have you heard anything, Congressman Huelskamp?
not anything good. And you might think as members of Congress that visit with a lot of other members and heard from the speaker today, I'll just say no information given. We see the same one-page offers and counter offers and those kind of things that you see, Sean, that's in the public. We don't get any more information. And I just think back to this deal in August of 2011, Sean, when they raised the debt ceiling. Clearly the American people said no. They raised the debt ceiling and promised they do spending cuts sometime in the future. Well, the future's here, Sean, and now they're working hard to undo the minimal spending cuts they agreed to a year and a half ago. So it's the same scenario. It feels like the same thing. It's a closed-door meeting with 2 to 3 people, and that's not the way Washington should work. Where's the American people's role in this? When did they get a look and see what's going to happen? I don't know what's happening, and I don't know what the deal is.
Now, let me tell you, one of two things are going to happen. We're either going to go over the cliff, or you're going to see John Boehner, Republican leadership, President Barack Obama will make the announcement that Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, both parties will be out there. I'd like to thank the gentleman from the great state and showing a willingness to compromise. I'd like to thank the other gentleman on the other side of the aisle for working so hard, pat each other on the back, go home for Christmas and not solve the problem.
That's right, Sean. I mean, what they define as success here is getting a deal done. And getting a deal done itself is not success. You got to get a deal done that is good for the American people.
I don't fear this fiscal cliff. And this is where I think that the argument has not been made to the American people. All of this has been about how much we're going to raise taxes and on who. And on whom. I don't think that that's what the argument ought to be. I think the argument ought to be is we're robbing from future generations. The real fiscal cliff is America's bankruptcy. We're headed to becoming Greece. We've got to stop borrowing 46 cents of every dollar we spend. We've got to reform entitlements and reform the tax code.
Absolutely. All the above, Sean. I was visiting with a 17-year-old student in Salina, Kansas. I said, Sam.
By the way, I've been to Salina. It's the midway point in the country.
Absolutely. It's right in the middle of everywhere in my district. And I said, Sam, everybody's talking Washington, D.C. They're all talking about themselves and what they think, what they're going to do, what committees. But nobody's talking about, Sam, about 20 years from now, you're going to be the one that's supposed to pay this all off. And that's wrong.
To me, that seems like an appealing argument because I think there's an inherent goodness in the American people. And when they realize that we're robbing our kids blind, they'd be willing to do the right, responsible thing. I mean, when Scott Walker made that argument to the people of Wisconsin, he was rewarded for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I've done 140 in-person town halls, and the things I hear from people at home are what they're willing to do when they know if they'd make some sacrifice, they'd be willing to do for their children and grandchildren. But that gets lost so much in the rigmarole of politics in Washington that is so far removed, and it's not a partisan thing, so far removed from what the American people want and what they're demanding, and I'm afraid it's going to be a bad result at the end of the year.
Congressman Amash, let me ask you, it seems to me that with the president just locked into this rigid obsession, ideological obsession of his to redistribute wealth and raise taxes and class warfare, why don't the Republicans just finally say, okay, you don't want to negotiate in good faith. You don't really want a balanced approach. You want to humiliate and embarrass us as a party. We're going to pass an extension of the Bush tax cuts for everybody. Mm-hmm. And then they can make the argument, it's up to you, the Democrats in the Senate, and it's up to the president. If you want everybody's taxes to go up, then don't sign the bill.
That's right, and that's one of the things being discussed. We want to see who's in favor of what. And at the end of the day, this whole tax argument is just a drop in the bucket of what's going on. We have a huge fiscal problem in this country. And whether you go with Speaker Boehner's proposal on taxes or whether you go with the president's proposal on taxes, we're talking about something that is really not much of a difference. It's a few days of federal spending every year.
8.5 days.
In order to get our budget under control, we have to cut spending. We have to do it.
Yeah.
And Republicans have shown they're willing to talk about revenues.
Cut spending first.
But nobody is going to talk about revenues in this kind of... Nobody should talk about revenues with these kind of deals on the table.
I agree with you.
If we're going to talk about revenues, then let's get some serious deals on the table.
Listen, you weren't elected to go there to be a carbon copy of the Democratic Party or co-opt their language or not fight for your principles. I don't understand it. So we'll see what happens, but I'm not overly optimistic. But, guys, I've got to run. Thank you, Congressman Justin Amash and Congressman Tim Huelskamp with us on the Sean Hannity Show.